Hello, everyone. As Academicus, we are here today with a brand new episode. Today, we'll be talking with Professor Margaret Hermann, the director at Moynihan Institute of Global Affairs, and Gerald B. and Daphne Kramer Professor of Global Affairs. We will be talking about the current state of foreign policy analysis. We are really excited to have Professor Hermann today, who gladly and very humbly accepted our invitation. So, Professor Hermann, welcome to our interview.
It's very nice to be here today.
Thank you so much. So without further ado, we are really excited to begin with the first question. So basically, we would like to know the start of your extensive academic career, which is really influential for young scholars as ours, which is how did you decide to study psychology and political leaders? And could you please explain the linkage between these two disciplines, psychology and foreign policy?
Okay, and it's more psychology and politics as opposed to foreign policy necessarily. Actually, I was a first-year graduate student, and it was the summertime, and I needed to earn some money to be able to stay in school and continue, and talked with a professor of mine he had a chair in the political science department at Northwestern as well as in the psychology department. So he already covered both fields. And he invited me to help him simulate the outbreak of World War I. He had a computer simulation that let you make decisions about the effects of decisions that leaders were making, but people actually played the roles within the simulation. And my actually focus during that first part of the summer was to read everything I could about the leaders who were in charge of the countries that were involved in the crisis in July 1914, which led to to World War I. So Kaiser Wilhelm, Tsar Nicholas, Poincaré, Lord Grey, coming from different countries. And then once I'd read the biographical and autobiographical material, was to take the California Psychological Inventory as if I were that leader, so that then we would have scores for what that leader was like. And then we could give the California Psychological Inventory to people like yourselves and actually look to see if we could find a match to Kaiser Wilhelm, Poincaré, Nicholas, etc. And then they would play in the simulation. Now the simulation, we changed all the names so people didn't know what they were playing, but we used the same kinds of documents as had been exchanged in the lead up to World War I. And we were able across that summer to do two runs of the simulation. In one run, there was a perfect match between the students playing the roles and the actual historical figures. In the second, the match was not quite so good. In the first, they actually went to war in the simulation exactly the same time under the same kind of circumstances as they did in history. The second run, Lord Grey called for an international conference, which is what he did in the actual event. Everybody came together and they settled the crisis. So there was nothing different between the two simulations except the people. And I got hooked on looking at, okay, so what's the role of the people in these kinds of situations? And in particular, what's the role of the leaders? And why do certain leaders in situations as we had set up tend to engage in more aggressive behavior, whereas others are much more collaborative. And I've kind of spent the rest of my career trying to figure those things out. that's why I'm a political psychologist.
Okay, thank you so much for your answers. Our next question. Professor Hermann, in your extensive career, you became the pioneering scholar in leadership orientation studies. Based on your latest research, you developed the leadership trait analysis system, which enhances our understanding of origin policy analysis. Could you please tell us how the LTA came about? Where would you see its current state in the literature?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the growing out of this experience with the World War I simulation, my dissertation was a similar simulation run, but in effect, I gave, and these were people who worked at the Naval Training Station in Chicago, gave them a set of personality tests, and then put people similar kinds of characteristics into the decision-making roles in various countries. And we were interested in that simulation in the impact of crisis on policymaking, and in particular on when you had an unidentified attack happen, which happened at various times within the simulation runs. So that's where I began to play with the various kinds of characteristics that could have an impact on policymaking. As a result of that dissertation, and then really working at the Educational Testing Service, which develops various kinds of tests, like the SAT kind of test that we use a lot here in the United States. But I was interested in what are the characteristics that we talk about when we talk about leaders, because a lot of the writing in newspapers and in biographies, and when you write about the Cuban Missile Crisis or this kind of thing, it talks about the leaders, even though we often dismiss them then when we study the people. And I wanted to know, what are the characteristics that people are talking about? And really the 7 traits in the leadership trait analysis came out of interacting with experts, with policymakers, with historians, with political scientists, biographers, trying to get them to focus on what they thought were characteristics of political leaders that we ought to be paying attention to. And that's how the 7 characteristics that are in the LTA actually got started. And then it was thinking about, well, how do we measure these? And a lot of them are picked up in personality tests that have been used for long periods of time. So it was then taking those tests and saying, what are they looking for? And then how could we build that into a coding scheme where we could look at what the leaders say, speeches, interviews with them, writings, their tweets now, social media. How can we get at what's at the basis of these particular traits? So, things like the belief you can control what happens. In the personality literature, there is an internal versus external control, which is a big test that's been used for a long period of time. But if you think about political leaders, do they feel like they need control over events, over things that are happening in the setting, and how much control do they need? Donald Trump, 2 standard deviations higher than any other US president in this need to control the situation. President Obama, that was not something he needed to do. So it's thinking about, what are the implications for these various characteristics and how do we get at them? And how do we get at them systematically? So we're doing this relatively the same kind of coding for each time we look at what leaders are doing. And that's where the software really helps, because it's going to do the same thing. It's got a set of rules. It's going to put them into effect every time we look at the same material.
Thank you.
And please feel free to interrupt me too as I go as well.
Okay, the other question I'm going to ask you is about more about the leader traits and leader characteristics. I wonder, are the leaders observed in LTA are regularly updated?
Regularly what? I didn't quite get the last.
Updated.
Yes. Well, and you can have one of the really important factors that I hope all three of you will walk away with is we are looking not at the real personality of a leader. Okay, we're not doing that. We're looking at what we call the public persona. This is what what the leaders are willing to commit themselves to in what they say in the public arena. Does not necessarily match what we call as their personality. And so these characteristics may differ in different contexts by different levels of experience. A leader may feel much more comfortable in a setting in which they feel experienced or have a lot of interest than they do in settings they could care less about or they have very little experience in. And crisis, non-crisis kinds of events, things that will be stressful for them or not stressful. And one of the things about the LTA that I particularly like is that it gives us, because you can look at material from different contexts, different points in a leader's life, before they maybe got elected or appointed and after, in crisis and non-crisis, in a highly experienced terrain and not so highly experienced terrain. And you can see what's different and how they're going to act differently. So if you're really looking at policy making, you are able, as Robert Kennedy said in the 13 Days, the book, the last chapter says, putting yourself in the other party's shoes is critically important, understanding how they're going to react to what you are going to do. And leaders don't often do that. But what the LTA is trying to do is to facilitate you taking into account the context, and that you're looking at the public persona. So how does this leader reacting at this point in time to what's going on?
Thank you. And my following question is, how would you interpret the development of operational code analysis? Are there any points that you especially pay attention in that field?
Now, operational code analysis is different from LTA, okay? They're two very different things. The operational code analysis is focused on what we call cognitions or beliefs. And so they're looking at what are the beliefs you have about how politics works. Now, two of the LTA characteristics, distrust of others and in-group bias, can get at the beliefs and begin to get at how the operational code is often used. But operational code analysis is a very different phenomenon from kind of what I'm doing in the leadership trait analysis. I'm really looking at leadership style and how the leaders are interacting in the setting. And it's why decision units become important, because that's the setting, the context in which they're trying to get things done. Now, they come to that with an operational code, a set of beliefs about what's going to happen. And those two can differ. They can be more instrumental or they can be more philosophical. But the LTA and the operational code are very different, and they're two very different programs for getting at them.
Thank you very much, Professor Hermann, for your response. We are asking very detailed and lots of questions from different various subfields of foreign policy analysis. So we are really glad you're really for your patience, and we are really thankful for your patience. So the next question we thought of while we are reading and discovering foreign policy analysis literature is the factor of culture in leaders' discourses. Would you consider culture or today as primary importance, or sometimes the traces of their culture are seen in the discourse of the leaders as well? So we are wondering, would you think that the phenomenon of culture should be of primary or secondary of importance?
The Iranian, I have data on 31 Iranian leaders, okay, current leaders. That data suggests that Iranian leaders are 2 standard deviations more conceptually complex than any other leadership group on the globe. So don't think they will ever say yes or no. They're going to say yes, but, and, if, under certain circumstances, or no similarly. So yes, culture makes a lot of difference. And to some extent, that's why we think about norming groups, so that we collect data on groups of leaders to see how culture, you know, in effect, with my 31 Iranian leaders, I'm controlling for culture, and I'm showing how they differ even within a culture. But I'm going to compare them more to their own scores as opposed to other groups of scores or the whole world scores, because I believe culture really does matter. So our norming comparison groups are often from within the same culture.
Thank you, Professor Hermann. And the next question, as you mentioned in your work, LTA is built on English words. If LTA is applied to other languages, what would be possible issues regarding the leaders in different geographies and cultures? How could such issue be overcome?
And this is the question always asked me. What's the impact of translation on what happens? I did when I was starting out, I did a study where I had people I trained individuals, and they mostly were students like yourselves, trained students who spoke native languages, Cyrillic, Swahili, Spanish, Mandarin, a couple of others. And I trained them in what I meant by the characteristics. And then I coded material that was translated. They coded material from the original native language. And the correlations were about 0.84 on average across this. So it didn't seem to make as much difference. And now we do actually have the Profiler Plus, the LTA, in several different languages. And actually Turkish is one of them, Arabic, Spanish, German. The problem is when you start doing that, if culture matters, you've just worked yourself into focusing only on that culture. And that's fine. If you want to compare the leaders and you want to study the leaders within that culture, that's great. But if you want to then compare around the globe, it becomes much more difficult, because the languages are going to make your data much more specific than when it's translated. So again, it's who are you comparing? Who are you studying? Depends, kind of leads you to go one way or the other. I've worked with the German translation, and it's almost too specific. It's too detailed. And it means it's very hard to do the coding in other languages because they don't pick up. And you all know this too. some of the idioms. And so the scores are going to be much larger. And that's going to make them not the same as the scores where we use the same set of rules. This is, if we use the software, the profile, the same set of rules for all leaders. Still means within each of the cultures, you're going to get similar kinds of scores, just like we did with the Iranian leaders. It just means they won't be as specific as you might get were you to do it vis-a-vis a particular language. But if you wanted to say we're going to look at all Arabic leaders, then take the Arabic scoring. But even there, the different dialects across the Middle East and North Africa sometimes would interfere with the comparisons.
Thank you. My other question is, what are the ways to validate LTA's validity today?
What are the ways to do what here? Would you repeat
what are the ways to test the LTA's validity today?
Well, there are many ways of thinking about validity. Face validity, I think we could say, probably, we get it. Need for power, distrust. We're looking at things that probably on the face of them seem like you're picking up what you want. But we have tried a couple of ways of getting at construct validity, and are we really trying to measure? Are we measuring what we think we're measuring? And one of the validity tests that we did was getting a group of journalists and charge d'affaires and really some ambassadors who had actually interacted with the leaders themselves. And we did this for 21 countries. And I was given material for each of those 21 leaders, but with no names in them. It's the most boring coding I think I've ever done in my life, because it was A, B, C, D for cities. It was QRS for people. It was, can I code this dull material and still get at the LTA? Then what we did was we asked the journalists, the charge d'affaires, and the ambassadors to say, given their interactions with these leaders, what kinds of behavior would they, did they see the leaders engage in? And we gave them a questionnaire on leadership and asked a set of questions. And then I took the scores, not knowing who the people were, and made the same kind of forecasts based on the scores. What would I think these leaders would do? And there was a 0.82 correlation between what the charge d'affaires, the journalists, and the ambassadors predicted and what I predicted across the 21 leaders. So a little bit of validity that we're getting at the same things that they're thinking about. Somebody said you should try it in law firms, because they actually, have to decide who's going to become the person's in charge. It tends to be a group setting, but then you're looking at a group setting. So the issue of validity is always going to be difficult, but we've tried a variety of things to get at it.
Thank you, Professor Hermann. Other question is, LTA studied only with leaders' discourses. Can, for instance, diplomats be studied through LTA if their discourses are gathered?
In other words, can we do it for other than the actual national leader? Is that the question? I mean, we've done this. I do this for students in my class. So you can do it for anybody. And we've done it with terrorist kinds of groups. We've done it with leaders of insurgent groups. We've done it with CEOs of humanitarian relief organizations, TNGOs, and development organizations. And that's really interesting because they're very, very different people who choose to kind of go into leadership positions in those two organizations. We've done it with the bureaucrats at mid-level across a number of countries. We've done a lot of it in kind of training settings. We have a group of veterans going to Syracuse University who are interested in running for political office. And so we got them, took their applications that they had answered a series of questions and ran them through the leadership trait analysis, the Profiler Plus program, and then talked a little bit about what are the particular political settings in which their profiles look like they would best fit. And to have them think about those as being the settings that they might want to go to try a run for a political office. But yes, you can do it for just about anybody. Do it for yourselves.
Yeah, exactly. And in our daily conversations and like assignments for foreign policy courses, especially my friends here, Johnson, they're also building, if I'm not mistaken, correct me guys, they're also trying to build simulation and different simulation types, in fact, for different people and persona as well. So really interesting to hear your thoughts on this. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, think about, I don't believe there's 7 characteristics to leadership trait analysis. I don't believe any of us are one characteristic. We're a mixture. And so part of my work has been actually putting the characteristics together and thinking about what are the leaders who challenge constraints? What do they tend to be like versus those who are much more respecting and willing to work within the setting? You know, you think about someone like a Saddam Hussein never should have had all the impact that he had, but there's a guy that just, you know, stood up and said, I'm important, so pay attention to me. A lot of the European, particularly Western European countries, most of their leaders, prime ministers, tend to respect constraints because otherwise it would probably be in that office. So it's thinking about how do the traits go together? And so which leaders are more sensitive to information, which seek out information, which are fairly sure of themselves as they move forward? Do you tend to focus on solving problems, or are you much more interested in bringing a group together? And these are kind of the leadership styles that I'm interested in having people think about, because they're really what's going to kind of set the train for who are the advisors you're going to have, depending on what you're like. If you want to solve problems, you're going to choose people who will go along with you, carry it out, and be the implementers. But if you're really interested in bringing a group along, then you're going to want to, you know, kind of circle the wagons, make sure everybody's feels a part of it, and it's going to be a slower process in moving forward. So it's thinking about the nature of leadership style, and that's why then I think leaders become much more important, and in thinking about what's actually going to happen. And we know in crisis kinds of situations, there is generally a contraction of authority to the top. And even if they don't want to, the leaders really are going to become accountable. So then it's really looking at how do they react to stress? And in effect, what is their leadership style? And how are they likely to deal with this situation? Because they're going to get it almost regardless of whether they want it or not. Do they then engage in the blame game, etc.? So, you know, there's a lot of nuance to leadership, and, you know, just the differences that we see as leaders change suggests, and that's why 29 countries, 133 different leaders. Even the same leader, but with a little different organization, can behave very differently.
Thank you, Professor. I'm going to apply your suggestions. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you so much. We have last 2 or 3 questions, so without tiring you much or taking more of your time. So in our email communications with you, you kindly sent us and shared us some examples from your work exploring the assessment at a distance technique. So for our audience as well, could you please explain that to our audience, and how does it contribute to the broader leadership analysis?
Yeah, and well, in effect, what I was giving in that chapter is a number of ways, different ways of assessing at a distance that are more or less systematic. So psychobiography is a little less systematic, but it's a way of looking at leaders and trying to explore, why are they different? Why do they stand out? So it tends to focus on leaders who do things that don't seem unrealistic in the setting in which they happened. So, you know, the Woodrow Wilson and his inability to give up on the League of Nations and how it was going to be formed. And he could have gotten it. He could have gotten the US to join, but he was very dogmatic and obstinate. Why? When he was open to having compromise, et cetera, at other points in time. So it's trying to explain odd kinds of things. Bolsonaro in Brazil, why is he holding on so tightly to being anti the pandemic? It's not really happening. So it's trying to explain things that just don't make sense that are happening right now. And there are also something we call structured focus comparison, which we've used in a number of settings. And in fact, we've used it with a crisis database. And this is where you have a coding manual where you ask the same questions of each case. So if we say that a crisis, or somebody says that Erdogan has 3 or 4 crises that he's having to deal with right now, and we're going to take each of them, we're going to look at each of them, but we're going to ask the same questions about them. Because one of the things that we've learned about crises is that how the leaders define the amount of time that they have to deal with the crisis and how much of a surprise they saw it as being can shape the way they interact in the crisis situation. So we ask a series of questions about how the leaders interpret the crisis situation and what they did, but it's always from their perspective. And then because you've asked the same questions, you can compare and contrast the cases so that you actually get data out of this. So you've got in-depth case studies, but you've also got a data set. Done the same thing with the safe havens that insurgents, terrorists, transnational criminal organizations actually operate or govern from. And then the assessment at a distance, looking at personality. And one of the really great personality theorists who has done a lot of assessment at a distance, David Winter, has talked a lot about the fact that in effect, we only tend to give a personality test to a person at one point in time. And yet I've made an argument to you all that we change, that the context matters. And David believes that too. Context is critically important. Stress, how much stress? You're talking about emotions. So what is it about the setting that's leading to these emotions? What about experience? What about culture? Those are all contextual kinds of things. And his argument and my argument are that we have to take context into account. So it becomes important to think about the nature of this context and to give personality tests more than once so that you can take context into account for the people that you're studying and looking at. So many different ways of doing assessment at a distance, but we're driven to do assessment at a distance because we can't give personality tests or psychological interventions to political leaders because we'd cause them trouble if we did, right? If what we told them got out and we said, you're sick, it's going to have a certain impact on their political futures. So they're not going to engage in this. Foolishly, when I was younger, I was on a commission actually for the State Department, and we made the proposal that every US president ought to have somebody in the White House who does nothing but watches the president. And whenever they sense that the president's under stress, gets them out of the situation for a little while. And it's interesting, you know, nobody's taken that seriously with a psychologist, but it is interesting that most of the US presidents have somebody that gets them out of the situation when they start getting a little tense. So Obama had a young man who would take him out to the golf course when he thought he really needs to relax. It'd be interesting to know on Biden, and Trump also had somebody that kind of pulled him away. And it's something we talk about with leaders, that they all need these confidants that help them deal with certain situations and get them out of the context when they're going to probably fall flat on their face.
Thank you, Professor Hermann. That was an interesting one. And our final question is about leaders' discourses. If you would do a ranking, is the most important phenomenon affecting the discourses of the leaders is the turning points in country, for example, like September 11, or the country's place in the international system as a rising power, let's say?
You can't say one versus the other. See, that's where the context becomes important, right? So is 9/11 a crisis or a situation that the person can take advantage of and push forward on something? So if I'm in the US, 9/11 might be a crisis, maybe in Europe too. But if I'm in the Muslim Brotherhood or in Saudi Arabia, I might say more power to them. So, you know, that's why I think it's important to think about what the nature of the contexts are and how they might impact what leaders can do and which ones will be more important for which types of leaders. Leaders with certain kinds of leadership styles, certain types of situations and contexts are going to be more important than others. But, you know, those are all settings that I'd want to study. But it was interesting. On 9/11, 2001, I was actually in a conference in London, England. And we had broken for the day. It had actually ended at noon London time. And I'd taken off for the British Museum, hoping I'd get to see it before I had to leave for the US. And at around 2:30, 2:45, over the loudspeaker came this comment: if you are an American, go to the nearest pub, something terrible is happening in your country. And of course, when we went, we saw the World Trade Center actually, implode. And I was there in London for a week. But it was interesting that later on that afternoon on 9/11, Tony Blair spoke to the Labour Party Congress, or Labour Party, yeah, it was the Congress at that point in time. And his comment was, this is a crime against civilization. We will bring the rule of law and we will use our courts to bring these criminals to justice. And I was there for a week. I got back in the United States and I learned, no, that's not what 9/11 was. 9/11 was an attack on America. It was a highly nationalistic event. We were at war with terrorism and we'd use our military to deal with it. Now, folks, that's the same event, but framed very differently. And think about how those frames have kept on since 9/11. Very difficult once the leaders have framed something to change it, particularly in those kinds of settings. So this is the other way leaders become very important, is in how they frame the events, particularly crisis events. It's probably one of their major roles in a crisis, is how they're going to frame it, because that defines the event for the population. And the U.S. hasn't gotten out of the war on terror all these years later. Europeans tend to bring the criminals to justice according to their idea about justice.
Thank you so much for your answers. That concludes our interview with Professor Hermann. We would like to thank Professor Hermann for accepting our invitation and sharing her insight with us based on her career and her studies on leadership trait analysis. Follow us on our social media channels. You can also listen to episodes from YouTube or podcast channels like Spotify. See you soon.